My name's Riza Bardin. I'm the operations manager for Lefa La Rona Trust, which is one of 6 development entities that were established by Anglo American Platinum in 2011. I've been in the education and development space since since I left school, and my passion's development, and I'm grateful to be able to work with a number of operations managers, the chairpersons, the trustees of the various trusts, who are all passionate about what impact we can actually have within mining communities in particular. As I indicated, in 2011 it was established as part of what was then called Project Alchemy, and this went beyond Anglo American Platinum's license to operate. It was an opportunity to explore and almost pioneer this notion of community ownership, benefit sharing in a sustainable business. Then the very first trust that was established was Lefa La Rona Trust, and its agenda was to be able to, and mandate was to establish 5 other entities, and these entities or development structures consist of 4 development trusts and 1 non-profit company. The development trusts work within mining communities, primarily deep rural, peri-urban mining communities around Anglo American Platinum's mining operations. And there's a unique set of, I think, challenges that we find within these communities. And if we look at what we call the active and dynamic profile of these communities, it guides how these trusts think about, plan, coordinate and facilitate development as integrators or facilitators of development. I think the profiles that concern us greatly is if we look at the multidimensional nature of poverty. It's not just that somebody doesn't have a job. It's influenced by a community's access to nutrition. It's influenced by the quality of education, the quality of primary health care, safety and security, psychosocial matters, gender equity and gender-based violence, etc. The second development lever, which I think is very relevant in terms of the context that we work in, is this notion of resource mobilization. And I'm specifically calling it resource mobilization as opposed to funding mobilization. And with resource mobilization, what we appreciate is that there's a whole host of development relevant resources out there. How could we facilitate, curate and conduit that into our communities if it has value? For example, we recently in November 2019, as well as December and January 2020, we recently launched a pioneering program within these communities that's called the Free Community Wi-Fi Development Platform. And why that's important is, I think, the challenge that many development agencies face is that it's easy to run pilot programs. It's easy to focus on 1 or 2 communities. It's easy to focus on 1 or 2 elements or pillars or priorities within a community. And the fact that all of our 6 development entities collectively work with, support and co-design a sustainable future with our communities, that totals almost 1 million primarily deep rural and peri-urban community members. What that means is we need to be very clear around our theory of change. We need to be very clear around how a particular intervention or program or project or initiative is contributing towards realizing that vision. it doesn't give us the luxury of a haphazard approach. I think the notion of employment, it's a very complex one. I think the bulk of, and we're surmising, that the bulk of the youth in particular that we work with in primarily, as I said, deep rural and peri-urban communities. Firstly, they still largely the majority, number one. Number two, we surmise that most of them have actually not had the first chance of employment. And that's a challenge bigger than those who have had exposure and experience and started to build an employment background or track record. And I think the nature of employment for these two categories of individuals is different. In an economy, in a global economy that is challenged, in a South African economy that's challenged, we're seeing well-educated, very experienced people in the peak of their careers also unemployed. So it's, I think because the nature of employment and unemployment is so diverse, the opportunity to remedy or address or strengthen this with a single approach, I think, is a challenge. So what we're trying to do, one, is deepen our understanding, and I think with that in mind, we're actually looking at the requirements to be able to design for impact. And that's very different to operating as grants managers. With grants managers, to some extent, the accountability goes with the funding and the completion of the project, and that's the end of it. With the approach we're taking, it's the harder one, it's the more challenging one, but because we're here for the next 20 to 30 years plus, we can afford to take on the more difficult task, and that is to ensure that we have access to some of the best innovative and creative minds to help to make sense of, to understand where best to invest strategically and catalytically. And hence we partner with universities, we partner with other community-based organizations. We're engaging with the UNFPA at this point in time around the phenomenal work that they do specifically around gender-based issues globally. And to have that deep understanding so that we can ensure that the limited resources that we have access to, that it has the greatest potential for positive impact. The original intent behind the Community Wi-Fi Development Program was to also become a platform for communication and collaboration with ordinary community members. And to be able to hear those voices very loudly and very clearly, and to be able to co-design what a community's transformative principles or views are. Having launched as recently as between November 2019 and January 2020, because they were separate and independent launches in different communities. The next phase, and I think for the balance of 2020, the key call to action is around awareness, adoption and usage. Now that this community asset exists within the community, we need to continue, and I think this interview is a good example with social TV to be able to get the word out there. From a Rustenburg Community Development Trust perspective, I think one of the biggest programs we're seeing, or projects being rolled out, there's a multi-million rand water and sanitation program that's bringing those services to the communities. And again, it's driven by this notion of how do we think strategically in terms of where that investment takes place, how this contributes to compounding impact and towards a trajectory of sustainable and thriving communities. Access to clean drinking water is critical, as well as the health implications of not accessing sewage and sanitation services. And I think that's the driver. We're constantly looking at this integrated approach. Having adopted in the transition from grants management to development facilitation, we've just gone through a process with all of the the 6 development entities to embed this notion of impact by design. And it's through global benchmarking. We implemented similar frameworks that are utilized by international development agencies, UN agencies, but also the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We're using pretty much the same frameworks that includes design thinking, theory of change, social return on investments, so that before and as we in fact strategically and catalytically invest in development programs, we are very clear on how this is going to contribute towards that ultimate vision around sustainable and thriving communities.
For more stories like these, go to www.social-tv.co.za, subscribe to us on YouTube and follow us on our social mediums.